Starfield. Here we are, the next big single-player experience from Bethesda Game Studios and the big blockbuster game for Xbox to close out 2023. The position that Bethesda Game Studios finds themselves in is quite a predicament, where their brand and image is still in a stage of recovery after the disastrous release of Fallout 76. Coupled with the fact that Starfield was also supposed to be the big follow-up release for Xbox's big juggernaut for the first half of the year, Redfall, to say that the stakes are high for Starfield is an understatement, and for Xbox broadly speaking. Thankfully, in my eyes, Starfield is a home run for both Bethesda and Xbox, and one that is sorely needed. It may not land for everyone, as we've seen now critics are fairly mixed on this game, seeing scores that vary from different levels, and I think many of the scores that we've seen are valuable and meaningful in different ways depending on how this game lands with you, because I do think first and foremost that Starfield is a divisive game. But to me, Starfield is an odd feeling game where it feels like it's ambitious, but also outdated simultaneously. Starfield is a game that takes many forms and includes many features, some that will wow you and others that are beginning to show their age. But ultimately, Starfield doesn't reinvent the wheel, but instead provides an experience to me that is a culmination of all Bethesda's learnings from their 20 years of making these grand RPG experiences, particularly the Elder Scrolls and Fallout. It takes many of the best aspects of these games and melds them into one experience. To some, this game may feel outdated, and in some respects I will say you're right. But with that being said, Starfield feels like a love letter to that familiar feeling and DNA that I feel made us fall in love with these games in the first place. And if you don't like that, then chances are you won't like Starfield. Starfield is a game that when showcased back in June looked to be extremely ambitious, aiming to tackle various components of the sci-fi space exploration experience. When everything is clicking together and you're in sync with this game, Starfield is a game that feels like another immersive universe that Bethesda have been able to create. However, Starfield's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, as the sheer amount of scope of Starfield's universe feels like it's fighting against you at times through its fragmented exploration that has you filtering through menus to fast travel to each destination, which can provide a polarizing experience even to those who have been in love with Bethesda games and that formula from the get-go. So after 100 hours, how do I feel about Starfield? Well, in the span of that time, I've become a ranger, a pirate, got married, stopped a space alien outbreak, and built some crazy ships, become a storyteller to the media, and worked for a megacorp, just to name a few things that come to mind. There is a wealth of activities, quests, and experiences to be had here in Starfield, and I haven't even completed all there is to do in this game. In terms of the questing, there is still so much out there that people are discovering and finding, and I'm like, oh wow, I need to jump back on and do that. Starfield is a game that I have more fond memories of than negative ones. It's a slow burn that slowly opens up and exposes you to its vast universe the more you engage with it. It's a game that shoots for the stars, and when it hits the right notes, shines as bright as one. You may not love it straight away, and I do believe this is due to what I would call a calibration period where you're settling into the world and various systems, because there is a lot to unpack and a lot that Starfield tries to do. It makes sense why people would bounce off this game. However, I do feel like Starfield isn't a Fallout or Skyrim in space. It is a rather different game that is an amalgamation of those things, but pulls many principles from games such as Daggerfall with its procedural generation and open-ended kind of exploration, to an extent. I feel Starfield is overall a video game that is greater than the sum of all its parts, and a great game that I do think you should try with the right expectations and idea in mind of what this game is. So without further ado, let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my review of Starfield. So we'll kick this review off by discussing the story and the universe for Starfield, which, much like any other BGS game, you take control of a customizable character who is working in the mines when one day you discover an ancient relic known as an artifact. Upon this discovery, the player is inducted into a team of adventurous explorers known as Constellation, and the journey and collecting of these artifacts officially begins, and you search and find what the meaning behind these artifacts is. The main questline for Starfield overall is pretty decent. It has moments where it really shines, and then other moments where it can feel really weak. I think that's due to the pacing of the story, as I do feel a large portion of this game does have you collecting artifacts in a way that is very familiar once you've done it a couple of times, but I do think there are some other highlights to the story here. It ebbs and flows a lot, is how I would describe it best. Starfield's missions do feel varied, and they do feel like they offer and see a return of choice, and I do feel that this feels earned based on the way that you build your character. You can persuade certain characters, even in the main story, to enhance the outcome and have it play in your favor. There's some cool levels here and cool missions, with one that really reminded me a little bit of that one level in Titanfall, if you know you know. But I do feel that the story also does come with some moments that can feel a little dull, and also feel boilerplate, like a side quest. And this is what I was kind of getting to earlier with this repetition with some of the story, particularly in its earlier half, which can be something that makes you bounce off this game, and another thing that attributes to that overall divisiveness if you're just trying to beeline the main story. With that being said, Starfield's world and universe didn't spring to life at me through progressing through the main story, but more through its lore, the history, factions, and side quests that played into fleshing out the broader world that is populated, known as the Settled Systems. And I think that, like with any other Bethesda game, a lot of this source, a lot of the juicy bits come out of the side content more than the main story. So how are the factions, the side quests, and all of this side content in Starfield? Well, Starfield, like any other BGS game, fleshes out and expands upon the broader universe and the current conflicts through the use of factions. Factions in Starfield are used as a driver to provide insight on many of the different major players and perspectives of prominent figures in the Settled Systems. But on top of that, these factions are very much indicative of the lifestyles that inhabit many of these various cities and factions and ways of thinking in our future. The role that you play in these questlines are also distinct and make you feel like your actions have an impact on the world and you're making a difference. I loved many of the different faction quests here, from being a space pirate, going on these crazy adventures with the Crimson Fleet, to living a space cowboy on Aquila with the Freestar Collective. Another thing that I loved about the faction quests here is how they too, similar to the main questline, also come with this level of choice. That really does have an impact on how you can approach many of these situations, and that oftentimes you will see characters reflect upon your actions, and it will greatly diverge how you have handled that situation and how people think of you based on that. For example, the first time I went to Aquila City, I saw that there was a bank robbery taking place. There was multiple ways I could have went about this. I could have went in there guns blazing, but I chose the silver-tongued persuasion approach, and I spoke to them over the phone, and I was going, hey, you guys can step down and, you might get a lighter sentence, trying to convince them. And through that means of solving and diffusing a situation, I was able to solve the problem with a non-violence approach. This is also reflected upon when people talk to you and say, I like the way you handled that, and look through the sum of your actions and say, this is your character, this is your type of person. And there's a lot of different types of characters, your companions and other characters that will look at you a certain way based on that. But characters can get angry, can get mad at you based on the way you handle situations, and I do think it provides a level of depth and weight to your choices. On top of the stellar faction quests comes a bunch of side quests which provide more intimate scenarios that flesh out many of the smaller settlements and cities within the Settled Systems. The way that you are also able to acquire these quests too is quite fascinating. You can just stumble upon something randomly, or even just have a random guard or some person just come up and just tell you something, and then you have this quest known as an activity that'll be jotted down, and that'll lead you on your own little rabbit hole of pursuing this quest. It is something to me that is familiar but weirdly refreshing. Starfield explores a diverse set of stories that are scattered across the far reaches of the Settled Systems, where you can pick up an audio log that guides you to a secret outpost, to helping a stranded fleet of people on a ship that are trying to make contact with this paradise resort below and trying to grav jump to another galaxy or integrate with these people. There is so many different places to explore, and I find the little towns and cities to be one of the highlights of discovery within this game. There are also companion quests, like with many other Bethesda games that you're probably used to, and like you would expect with them, you can get to know these characters well, and you can develop an intimate relationship with them both romantically and platonically, and having these relationships, you can get to know their struggles, their stories, and their aspirations to some degree. I do still feel like they are Bethesda characters in a lot of ways where they do feel stiff at times. I spent a lot of my adventures with Sarah Morgan, and I did really grow to like her character, but there's something that I feel many other RPGs have where they bring these characters to life in a quirky way. I think more recently about games like Baldur's Gate, or I think about a game like Cyberpunk and those side companion stories, and there's a certain level of intimacy that you get with these characters where they feel a bit more real, and I feel like I really did like Starfield's characters and I like their stories, but there's just this level there that just, they're a notch below. But honestly, the side content here in Starfield is one of the highlights and one of the most enjoyable aspects that I feel feeds and fuels the gameplay loop and keeps you invested. There is so much interesting ideas here to see how humankind has progressed in this future that feels grounded in a sense to our existence in our world. It feels like they have tried to keep this game realistic and grounded almost to a detriment in some ways. And I think that on the narrative side, they have built a pretty interesting universe, and there is a ton of great things here to see, because the game is divided into these big major cities like the New Atlantis, the Neons, the Aquila cities, these things that you've probably seen in the promotional material, and there's more minor cities and smaller things to explore, like this Paradise City that I've talked about, Paradiso, and other places such as Hopetown. There is tons of little other settlements at the far reaches as well where you can interact with characters and there's little sub-stories there. And this aspect of Starfield is one that I feel Bethesda have really nailed. And we'll get more into this later when talking about exploration, but I think that the way that they delegate and hand out these quests is also quite fascinating too. Starfield's combat feels the most fluid and fun that it ever has been within a Bethesda game. The gunplay in particular feels a lot more weighty and impactful depending on the particular weapon that you are using, and the sheer variety of weapons available throughout the playthrough is pretty crazy. There is a good variety of weapons here to get your hands on and experiment with. From the techie shotguns like the Shoddy that fires off these pump action rounds to old world weapons that resemble things like an AK-47. There are tons of different weapons that provide an added dimension to the combat. And I remember reading a couple of months ago that id Studio had helped Bethesda to some degree here with the combat, and it really can be felt and could be felt throughout my playthrough. It feels like the Bethesda team has really taken a lot of the aspects of Fallout 4's gunplay, arguably one of the more stronger components of that game, and have built on it heavily here with some returning features where you can peek from corners and shoot enemies. Another aspect to the gunplay that again feels like it's been built upon from the foundations of Fallout 4 is its mods that can be applied to the weapons in Starfield, because there is a large variety of mods that can allow you to tailor your weapons to your playstyle or approach. For example, adding scopes, making different rifles automatic or semi-automatic, full burst, all those type of things. Standard stuff, really. But there are tons of different mods that can provide different damage types that work as a proficiency against different types of enemies. Speaking of enemies, this side of combat does feel like it's a bit on the weaker side to its gunplay counterpart. The NPCs in this game are fairly standard for what you would expect in a Bethesda game. They can catch you out and kill you if you go to planets where the wildlife is over-leveled you by a great amount, but most of the time the enemies do feel like they are pretty easy to just run through, mow down and clear out an area. You can get overwhelmed at times and some enemies can just swarm you and kill you pretty quickly, but I feel like these instances are few and far in between, and most of the time the enemy AI is quite lenient. Whilst I was reloading in front of them, they would just stand there and watch me before I put another clip into them. It's like they weren't overly sophisticated, but wasn't incredibly bad that it made the game feel too easy, but I think that at the same time they aren't that hard to beat. But overall, I do think that the gunplay and combat itself is one of the enjoyable parts of Starfield, and I think it was really great, and I think that there is a lot there, and you know, it does make you feel empowered, and it does make you feel pretty good, and it's not enough to weigh the game down, but it is something that I feel may detract for some who are looking for a bit more of a challenge. We've talked about the gunplay, And while we're still talking about land combat, let's get into the melee combat. So my character wasn't super focused on melee, but I did use a few different weapons throughout my experience. I used the rescue axe, there was a blade as well that I used throughout the game, and the combat knife. I would use these at different portions in the game and different parts where I want to dabble around and see what it was like, and use also some hand-to-hand combat when I just want to get my fists dirty. I do feel overall that the melee combat was pretty decent, but I would say that it is just decent. From my experience of what I used with them, there was nothing really like with going for the stealth approach and trying to take down enemies from behind. There was no real finishes or animations like that when killing enemies. They were just whacking them one or two times seemed to be the way to go about it, and it kind of did feel like it was missing a little bit there. There's nothing like, if you're a fan of Fallout and you like the ability of like seeing limbs go flying and dismemberment and stuff, there's none of that in Starfield as well. So you can just, that aspect of melee combat isn't here in this game. I feel like some of the melee weapons do feel better in terms of like how they land and connect with enemies. I felt the rescue axe did feel chunky whenever I was hitting enemies, but the blades felt a bit flimsy. They felt like how they were made out of plastic whenever I hit an enemy. I do feel that swinging your fists though, like hand-to-hand combat, is pretty badass, and I think that aspect of the game really was sick. Like whenever you got the chance to just run in with like your fists and just start smacking people, it felt really like you were just Ramboing your way through and you could just uppercut an alien or jab a human. It was really cool. Like that aspect of the game I think was really fun, and I think the way that it feels is incredibly satisfying. And the two standouts were just the rescue axe and your good old fists. I didn't put too many skills though into melee combat, so take what I'm saying on this aspect of the game with a grain of salt to some degree. But you know what aspect I did put a lot of my skill points into? Ship combat. Yes, Bethesda have stepped into a new domain here, introducing ship combat into Starfield, which I'm not gonna lie, for the first 10 hours, it wasn't really clicking with me. I didn't like space combat, it felt clunky, awkward to navigate. But the more I engaged with combat, I customized my ship, explored the settled systems, space combat became one of these aspects of the game that I genuinely loved. The ship management aspects of Starfield are divided into two sides. There is the resource management side, so navigating your components, making sure that you can be ready for all situations whilst flying and piloting, so that's your grav jumps, having your lasers, your cannons, missiles all ready to go and having these allocations, and that feeds into the ship combat. And then there is the other side that is called the shipbuilding aspect, which we'll get into later, which delves into customizing and upgrading your ships to make sure the resources are sufficient enough for your travels. So for this segment, we'll be talking more about the resource management itself. When piloting your ship in Starfield, you'll be provided a finite amount of resources that you'll have to distribute and redistribute on the go. You can see this in the bottom left corner, where you need to put resources into things like lasers and missiles in combat, or putting points into your shields and grav drive if the situation takes a turn for the worst. The combat in Starfield, once you get a feel for it, is really a ton of fun, and it gets better the more you let it open up in terms of investing skill points and also engage with the shipbuilding aspect, as that allows you to allocate more points into your live resources when you are piloting your ship. I'll be honest, I grew to love the space combat of Starfield the more I engaged with it, and after doing a particular faction storyline, it felt like a ton of different modules became available to further blow the lid off the different ways you can build and tailor your ships. For all of Starfield's faults that you may find in its exploration, I do feel these zones that you explore in space, whether it's docking or exploring the massive abandoned ships, freighters, or dogfighting with a bunch of space pirates, these moments independently are a ton of fun. And I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we'll touch more on the exploration side of space later on. One final thing on ship combat that I think is great is that you can focus on different parts of an enemy's ship, and if you blow out their engines, you can attempt to even just dock and board that enemy ship, take out the crew members, steal the ship or their resources for whatever you like. It really does allow you to play into a fantasy of being a space pirate, and it really does let you just play and engage with combat in a diverse plethora of ways, because in some ways I would say, and I'm spoilers for later on in the review now, but I do think there are parts of the space exploration in Starfield that are left to be desired, but I think that these moments of ship combat, dogfighting are truly some of the highlights and best moments that you'll have venturing through space. The last and final piece of the puzzle that I would want to get into that I think is a big core component of how you roleplay in Starfield that I think does pseudo fall into the combat section is persuasion. The new persuasion minigame is a great addition where you can enter a dialogue with different NPCs and, you guessed it, persuade them to give you information, call a truce, or pay you more in certain instances. The influence persuasion has on choice makes it feel worthwhile attempting whenever you can, and there are a bunch of different skills that you can acquire that make you a silver-tongued bandit throughout this whole game, and you can really avoid so many actions and different combat segments if you have the dialogue and, can read your character very well. The minigame itself is quite fun to engage with, as you'll be given a range of different dialogue options to select from that will fill this bar of points to persuade a person. You'll be given dialogue options that are worth more points and have a color spanning from green, orange, or red, and this will dictate the level of difficulty or chance of failure that dialogue option has. However, one awesome thing that I feel Starfield does with this system is that it lets you play to the temperament of that person you are trying to persuade. If you understand the type of person you're trying to persuade, you can feel more confident attempting those harder dialogue options and having them work in your favor. Some examples from my experience was being a hostage negotiator and convincing the bank robbers to stand down and turn themselves in, or convincing space pirates to leave an outpost and stop looting a mining outpost because I'm like, yo guys, you shouldn't be doing this, and here's XYZY. And I went through the dialogue options and they left. There are plenty of opportunities available where you are able to flex your silver tongue and produce a much quicker and more effective outcome, and sometimes shorten the process to get to your objective if you handle these things with ease. The long and short of it really is that in Starfield, violence doesn't have to always be the option and isn't always the most effective option. So having persuasion up your arsenal is really a great tool that makes some situations go by a lot more quicker and easier than they otherwise would. There really is no shortage of methods to approach combat or situations here in Starfield, and I think this is one of the game's biggest strengths. It really does lean heavily into giving you choice and making you feel like your character has some form of significance with the traits and skills they've been given and that are applied. And overall, I would say that this is one of Starfield's greatest strengths, the way that it handles being an RPG. At the end of the day, you can fault or say many things that you want about Starfield, but one thing that I think it really does do well is how it handles being an RPG. And I think that the way it approaches combat, the way it allows persuasion, the way that you can handle various situations, which we'll get more into as this review progresses, is just one of the biggest strengths that I think makes me really love Starfield. So now that we've gone over the gameplay itself in Starfield, the situations, the combat, things of that nature, we're going to dive more into the gameplay systems, the things under the hood that feed the gameplay loop, keep it fresh, exciting, fun, and keep the process going for those hundreds of hours you'll be playing. And we'll be kicking things off with the character creation. The character creation in Starfield is probably the most detailed out of any Bethesda game to date in terms of the features that you can use to mold your character. However, on the RPG front, this does feel like an amalgamation of many of the character building aspects of Bethesda's prior works. You'll firstly be told to pick a class. Much like Oblivion, this will give your character a particular set of proficiencies in different skills. Some of these classes can span from being a netrunner, a space scoundrel, or even a ronin. These classes in of themselves also do provide their own unique set of skill checks for conversations and things like that, albeit rarely though. The second big component that factors into your character creation is 3 different traits that you can pick for your character. Most of these traits are pretty diverse, where they alter your game drastically. They provide something that is unique to your experience. The one I picked was Dream Home, that comes with a hefty debt, but a nice starting place, a luxurious little house in a not so far off planet. You can also choose to have parents, and the luxury of having parents also means you have to pay them and give them money. And you can also have the return of one of the best traits, which would be the Adoring Fan, which I'm sure many of you Oblivion lovers will love to see return in Starfield. For those who are unaware, the Adoring Fan is more of an obsessive fan, and he originally made an appearance back in Oblivion and sees a return here in Starfield as one of the crewmates that can join your crew and pretty much obsess over you and tell you you're the man the whole game. There is so many. There's about 20 different things that you can pick here that provide their own set of benefits. Some of them feel a lot more stat driven, and some of them feel like they do have game altering things. But I feel like most of the different traits that you can pick do provide something that shapes or shifts your experience in a particular way. From being a wanted man who is resilient but often chased down by a bunch of mercenaries, there is a ton of different things that you can pick to tailor your character a certain way and have your experience of Starfield feel a bit more unique to you. And now that we have an idea of where you start off and the core tenets of what you use to build a character, we're going to talk about how you evolve, build, and tailor your character throughout your playthrough. And this is primarily expressed through skills. So that brings me to skills. And where I say classes take influence from Elder Scrolls, I would say that the skill trees take influence from Fallout. But more importantly, Starfield's skill trees feel like a response to Fallout 4's middling skill tree progression, where you could be a jack of all trades in Fallout. Here in Starfield, whilst you can be very widespread in a lot of different areas, it still feels like you do need to tailor your character to certain strengths. Here in Starfield, there is an overwhelming amount of skill trees that are divided into different broad categories that you can tailor your playstyle to. Where this gets interesting is how you unlock or level up that skill. For example, you can invest a skill point into lockpicking, and then this will allow you to unlock the most basic of locks, but you'll need to actually use this skill, much like in the Elder Scrolls games, before you can upgrade that skill to unlock harder safes. This system feels like a perfect middle ground for progression between Fallout's perk-based system and the Elder Scrolls level up through usage system. The skills themselves in Starfield do feel like they provide a lot of useful abilities that do have a meaningful upgrade and use case to the player. They all contribute to a bunch of different playstyles and ways you want to approach situations. There's melee and weapon combat with different proficiencies tied to them weapons that you want to use, as we've touched on earlier. There are also different social related perks that allow you to meet speech requirements and avoid conflicts. That way, alongside with stealth and theft, picklocking can also be a useful skill to bypass enemies too. There is so many different forms of skills here, and they touch on a lot of the things that we mentioned earlier with response to the combat, persuasion, and things like this, that further enhance your capabilities, success rate, and way that you approach these situations. The skills and upgrades in Starfield always felt meaningful to me and provided an actual functional use that made my character feel like a certain type of character. For example, I picked Space Scoundrel, which would have me step into the roleplay of a Han Solo type of character, where I would pick a lot of my perks that would be focused on ship and piloting skills and using speech to navigate situations. I wanted to be this type of silver-tongued, witty character who could, navigate situations through non-violent means, but also have proficiencies with weapons if things did get a little messy. But also, piloting ships took front and center, and that character feels special to me. It feels like something I built and grew throughout my playthrough, and I feel like in this aspect of the RPG elements, like I've said many times in this review and I'll keep repeating, Bethesda has hit the nail on the head here. Starfield feels like it really leans in heavily into the RPG aspects of its games, and when it gives it time to breathe and lets you embrace those moments, it is when the game truly shines. I think these are the highlight moments of Starfield, when you are taking on different side quests, main quests, and being able to flex your particular character's skills and strengths and really get into the zone of what type of character you have molded. So earlier I discussed the ship combat and said that ships in Starfield are divided into two separate components, ship combat and resource management, which revolves around the exploration, and then there's ship building, that component which is its own entirely different mechanic, and it's dynamic with how it plays into the overall Starfield experience, and that's what we're getting into now. So how is the shipbuilding in Starfield? Well, to me, it is one of the most addictive parts of the whole Starfield experience. This continuous loop of shopping around for new parts, exploring new locations, looting new ships, and trying to customize, modify, and squeeze that extra little piece of juice out of my ship was one of the greatest parts of the experience. Not to mention the new perks and skills that you'd have to acquire to unlock many of the new things that these vendors would refresh with as well. It made interacting with every little part of Starfield's different progression systems feel meaningful and feel like you're working towards this broader common goal in what you are doing with regards to your ship. But it isn't just the individual components of the ships that you can assemble and make for your space travels to make them go smoothly, but also the crew that you can pick up and adopt throughout your travels, spanning from the members of Constellation to other companions that you'll meet throughout the settled systems. Another great spot if you're looking for extra set of hands is a few of the various different bars scattered across the settled systems, which have people that are always in need of a job that can be staffed to work either at your outposts or your ships. The ships in Starfield are comprised of many different components that you'll be juggling, spanning from the habs, which house people, to cargo holds, which are the main place that you'll be storing a lot of your loot, and trust me, you will need that storage, which we'll get into later on. The mixing and matching, little upgrades, and the sheer level of expression that you can have with your ship is outstanding. It's astounding to me. I've seen so many people remake so many of the different famous ships from other works of science fiction, from the spaceship from Cowboy Bebop to the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. There is so many different types of things that people are creating here and getting crazy with that it is just insane to see. And you can make a ship that's bulky to different abstract ships that will just completely dominate in combat. The shipbuilding aspect of Starfield can feel extremely overwhelming at first, but trust me, the more that you start to play around with it, the more you start to get a feel for it. This is one of the parts of the game that'll keep you playing for a long time and really get you addicted to this overall aspect of the game. And whilst there is something that can be said for the overall ship experience, I do think that there is 3 components here, and I think Starfield nails 2 out of 3 of them. The third one I'm going to talk about shortly, but I think the shipbuilding and the ship combat are 2 really good features that Starfield has adopted in terms of this space exploration aspect. And I think that they've really nailed it here with how they make you feel like you can simulate that experience of having a crew, having a ship, and traversing the far depths of space. The biggest win to me, I think, with the shipbuilding aspect of Starfield is how it manages to be a ship builder mechanic, but also a ship management mini sim kind of mechanic with the people that you are juggling and managing between your ship and your outpost. What people are the best resources for what type of ship you're going for and what type of captain you want to be in terms of how you manage your ship. Are you going to be a space pirate? Are you going to be someone that is managing a lot of cargo and doing a lot of cargo missions? Like, what type of person are you going to be role-playing as? And ultimately, I think that this aspect, in terms of how you build your ship, how you prioritize what resources, in terms of both crewmates and different components you put on your ship, they all feed back into how you want to roleplay. And like I've mentioned, and will reiterate, this is what I think they've done so well here. They have so many aspects of many of their mechanics seep so well into this feeling of roleplaying as a certain type of character you want to be. Starfield sees the return of Outposts. It feels like Bethesda have gone all in on the foundations and sandbox that they established with settlements back in Fallout 4. Here in Starfield, the Outposts feel like they provide a more practical and meaningful use case that transforms the game from being a space exploration RPG to a more base building sim to some extent. These outposts that you build will have you collecting resources to build new facilities within your outposts. It feels like a much more simplistic version of something like Satisfactory at times, with you mining resources to produce and further expand your outpost and, well, your factory, where you're storing and making different new items and resources to produce and manufacture new items to further elevate your outpost. Much like how you can assign crew members to your ship with your ship management side of the game, you can also assign various companions that you'll find to your outposts. Here they'll work and live and take care of your outpost, and particular companions will have a skill set and set of abilities that will work really well with them managing or gathering resources for your outpost. So some people that you'll find are better suited to your outpost versus your ship, and it's just recruiting and hiring the perfect people for the perfect job. Outposts to me were one of those things in Starfield that I feel I neglected for a good part of my playthrough, but towards the later end, and even now, I'm still logging in to collect those resources and build and enhance my outpost, and it's become a real fun part of the experience and something that I've really enjoyed. And it's almost like a different game in some ways, where you're gathering these materials and trying to link all these different outposts that you have together through a thing called a cargo link, so you can share different resources. And of course, different planets will hold different resources, so there's all these different benefits. When they all pull together, you can craft and make better things for each outpost, and it's really great just to see how it evolves over the course of your playthrough. And you really can just sink like tens to hundreds of hours into this aspect of the game, so if you so choose. It'll be interesting to really see how Bethesda and the modding community in particular really do iterate on outposts, and I do believe that they've provided a strong template here, that being Bethesda, for these sandboxes to be further enhanced, whether they be horde based modes or whether they even just be leaning more into that kind of factorial satisfactory type of sim game where they go that route and get a bit more crazy with things. The various directions that they can really take this and lean into is absolutely crazy, and I think that this is one of those aspects of Starfield that I think gives it a lot more legs to stand on and longevity opposed to Fallout, because here in Starfield you can build outposts on any of these 1,000 planets, and on top of like the many stories and things that I believe mods can enhance, I do think that even Bethesda can add a lot of things to that outpost experience that'll only enhance it with time. I do think that now they've got a good base, and I think it is a pretty fun aspect, and I think that if you are someone that's in for Starfield for the long haul, keep an eye on this space because I think it's an interesting area where it can evolve. But at the same time, outposts are completely optional, so if you're not into it, don't feel forced that you have to participate, because this is an aspect of the game that you can completely ignore if that's not your thing. There is one aspect of Starfield that I would like to touch on as well, and it's an aspect that has taken also a lot of influence from Fallout 4, and that is the cooking and crafting systems that are found here in Starfield, and how they feed into the overall experience when playing the game. So first and foremost, the way that you'll be engaging with these systems is, most importantly, you'll have a foundational basic level of access to being able to craft things and being able to research things. The way that this works is a very interesting and fun loop. You'll be able to research by providing items that are core resources to unlock a particular mod, recipe, or things of this nature that'll then allow you to cook, craft, and make those particular items that you have researched. Where this starts to evolve and how you evolve this is through the skill trees. You'll have skills that allow you to make better mods and also research better mods to make. So therefore, through the skills that you acquire, you're able to craft better items, and then by researching these items, you can then make them and apply more of these different mods to your character, whether it's armor, guns, cooking, or crafting different medical resources. There's a ton of different things here that you can really make, as well as different resources for your outpost as well that you can also unlock and then further enhance the outpost side of the game. There is tons of different things here that you can really get into and dive into and focus on that really can elevate the experience from a more traditional looting all your enemies and equipping gear. To be honest, I'll tell you, if you haven't played Starfield yet, this is something you probably should look into as early as possible and get into throughout your playthrough, because this is something that I neglected and didn't pay too much attention to until roughly about 30 something hours into the game. And then I was like, oh, I can do all this type of stuff. I was wondering why I couldn't model these things, and then I noticed the skills, the researching and things like this, and then once I engaged with them more, I was able to like gear up my character and add a lot more different mods and things like this that made my character feel a lot more broken. It isn't something that is drastic or crazy, but it's something that I think really does open up the game in a different way if you do engage with it. So that's something that I would say is worth keeping in mind when playing Starfield. Okay, so now we're going to be diving into what I would say is the centerpiece for the gameplay systems, and that is how Starfield tackles exploration. And this for me is what is the most divisive aspect of Starfield for both myself and many others who have played the game. Starfield's planets and sheer scope feels mighty and grand. You think about it, 1,000 planets, 100 different star systems, it's quite a bold and ambitious endeavor. However, behind the curtain, when you first take off, you'll begin to notice something really glaring. Once you hit space, you aren't able to fly towards any distant planets. Instead, you have to enter your menu and fast travel to that planet. Okay, so you select that desired planet you want to fast travel to. That's cool, but then once you reach that planet, you then have to select a landing zone you wish to land on within that planet and start exploring. That's all cool. We knew you couldn't fly into planets and land, so then you land on your selected planet. From there, you can explore a certain procedurally generated piece of content. But what happens once you hit a wall? Then you are told that the boundary is reached and you have to go back to your ship and make a new landing zone to explore. At this point, you've been navigating through many different menus just to have about 20 to 30 minutes of exploration and then be told to go back to a menu and move forward. Starfield is a bit of a fragmented experience. I'll say, when it comes to exploration. There are aspects of it that really feel great, and there are other moments that feel very cut up and pasted together that make the game feel weak. And this is the aspect of the game where I feel like some of it feels like it is an ambitious game and then simultaneously an outdated one. There are many different modes of exploration throughout Starfield, 4 that I would like to discuss in this review that I think are very key to understanding how exploration works in Starfield, so your expectations are primed properly if you want to go into this game and know what you want to expect. So on a high level, the 4 different modes of exploration in Starfield is your fast travel traversal, which you'll be engaging with a lot, procedural generated exploration, which you'll be seeing when you land on a planet and just look around, mine minerals, see different caves and things like this. Thirdly, you will have your handcrafted content. This is more aligned with your traditional Bethesda experience, which is things like, your megatons, 10-penny towers, things like that from Fallout, things that have a story tied to it that feel intentionally made. And lastly, space exploration, which is these explorable areas within the orbit of a particular planet that you can fly around in before you land on a particular planet. So this is a high-level description of these 4 different forms of exploration, and now I'm going to tackle each one by one, starting with fast travel traversal. This is where my core issue with Starfield begins to emerge, as traveling between planets or locations within a planet begin to feel glued together through menus, which makes Starfield and its world feel more gamey and ultimately more fragmented. The thing is that many games, particularly RPGs, they do have loading screens, they do have menus, and I think that's totally fine. Hell, it's something that even prior Bethesda games have had, and let's be real, no one is manually traveling between each major city in a Fallout or Skyrim game every single time. You will be utilizing a fast travel. The long and short is fast travel is fine, and navigating through menus is fine. However, the problem, and why this feels so apparent with Starfield, is that there is no seamless option to manually traverse and explore each end to end of a particular location. It relies on menus, it makes you go through them, and overall, that is what builds this fragmented experience. So this fragmentation feels more apparent, more noticeable, and that is the biggest crutch that can shatter what is otherwise a distinct and interesting universe that is full of secrets, stories, and adventure that rival many of Bethesda's other best immersive worlds. Had Starfield had a bit more of a seamless experience where you could travel, but utilize fast travel if you wanted to, I think that the sentiment around this game would be a lot different, and rightly so. I think the capacity to use fast travel is something we realistically would be using anyway, but having no option to actually explore feels like something has been taken away from us. Couple this with the maps in big hub cities that don't have any visual bearings or maps to help you navigate, and it's very easy to get lost in the areas that count where a menu or a map would feel relevant. And whilst I do like the idea of exploration, I do think having some sort of bearings would be great. And then in other areas where you want to get lost and explore, it is heavily reliant on menus. It just makes the overall experience and navigation of Starfield just feel a lot more messier than it should have been. And it is something that you really have to get to grips with for the first few hours of the game, and is something that makes it harder than it needs to be. This fragmented universe is something that feels like an initial sting, a major blow that takes the wind out of Starfield's sails. However, after being able to accept this limitation in traversal and understand what kind of experience Starfield is, it begins to come clear what is glued together is in fact a diverse and expansive world full of quests that follow a similar methodology to many other Bethesda games. Starfield, however, is different here, oscillating between the new and old, where it takes a lot of procedural generation from games such as Daggerfall, its early works, and marries it with the more handcrafted content of their more recent works from Fallout 3 or Oblivion onwards. Keep that in mind when going into the exploration, because these are the 2 core components when you are on the ground and exploring, which is what we're going to get into now, and start off with what is procedural generation. So the procedural generation works in an interesting way here in Starfield, as you will notice that there is many different planets that are fully functioning, that have little towns and cities or outposts to desolate moons that occupy little to nothing. Starfield's worlds feel like they really do nail the atmosphere, but at times can feel vacant of things to truly do. And this is by design, as Starfield's design philosophy is to kind of encapsulate this real world aesthetic, making the universe and the settled systems feel somewhat grounded. But this doesn't mean at the same time that there is nothing to do at all. The first time I saw a ship land on a desolate planet even, I was like, wow, there's other people here, and whether they're friendly or not, you know, like UC settlers or pirates, it really does make these random encounters feel cool. And seeing a ship take off or land, it really is this feeling that you go from feeling all alone to suddenly there's people. It does have a unique sense of feeling to it. Starfield's worlds can provide these random encounters that do feel really amazing the first time you do encounter them. Somewhat repetitive after you've played for 100 hours, but I mean, with a lot of these games, like after 100 hours with these little random encounters, I do feel like it is okay for you to have seen a lot of these things kind of reoccur. And I feel like with this procedural generation stuff, it is kind of in creating your own fun. However, I do feel that some of this procedural content could have been a little bit more fleshed out, and there could have been a few more variants, as exploring some of these caves does provide little to no enemies from what I've encountered, and a lot of them usually do feel like you are walking in a U-shape, just collecting minerals and materials, or jumping through a few different platforms to find different minerals. Most bases as well feel like they do occupy 2 or 3 stories that are just full of ecliptic enemies that are bandits that you'll find in this world, and just clearing them out, you'll get some interesting loot here and there, but the layout of these bases does feel very familiar after you've done it 3 or 4 times. I'm not asking for it to be different every single time. I understand that it's procedurally generated, but having some variety or having these things kind of procedurally generate within their layouts and structures might add a bit more mileage to the experience, and that is something that you should keep in mind, is that some of these different experiences that you'll find out in the open world can become fairly familiar. But with that being said, at the same time, there's also a bunch of unique discoveries that myself and many other people in the Starfield community have made in terms of wildlife, habitats, things that occupy these planets, how these planets actually look. I saw on Reddit that there was one user who ran into a planet full of like these evil looking octopus aliens, and they were vicious to fight. There was a bunch of different types of enemies that people have encountered, and it just makes me wonder just how much scope is there in this game, and how crazy are all these different planets, and how varied are they? So I can't say with a full certainty and be definitive and say that each place is exactly the same, but from the planets that I have landed on and that I have explored, I have seen some overlap and familiar feelings that have come across with discovering the procedural side of the game. I don't think that that means that it is void of any meaningful experiences, because there is some fun there to be had, and there's a lot of unique wildlife, and seeing caves, structures and outposts and different things do provide some fun stories and unique moments. I think the best way to approach the procedural side of content is to use it as a nice break, a nice detour from the main content, because procedural content can provide a good level of fun. Now, with that out of the way though, I want to mention that some of these planets do have some unique hubs and towns and things that you can go and experience that do feed into that handcraftedness of the game, but add these planets a bit of charm. So like some examples of this in my mind are Hopetown and Paradiso. These places aren't large scale hubs like New Atlantis or Neon or something like that, but they are nice little detours and towns that do provide their own unique set of societies and settings that populate and make the world feel more alive, the universe of the settled systems. So I think there's a lot there to take away, but with procedural generation, it may ebb and flow on how much you enjoy it. So now we've talked about the procedural exploration, the discoveries made on land, I want to take to the sky and talk about space exploration. So before Starfield launched, we heard from Todd Howard, the man, the icon, the legend himself, and he mentioned that you could not manually land on a planet in Starfield, much like how in other space games like No Man's Sky you would be able to. Starfield is instead a game that is divided into 2 separate experiences, the planet exploration and space. He would say that these are 2 separate experiences, and he wanted to keep it that way. And this is what led me to believe that although we could not land on these planets and fly into them, there would be some form of space exploration within a solar system, right? Well, no. Technically, you can fly to another planet if you have put hours of attrition into just letting your ship fly aimlessly, as exhibited by Alana Pierce. But this is not by design or intentional, as even after hours of flying in a straight line to a planet, you won't be able to land on this planet or make a marker to land on it. You will have to fast travel to it to kick off the menus to actually land on that planet. So if that's not how space exploration works, then how does it work? Well, much like how exploration on land works in Starfield as an explorable hub, the space exploration operates in a similar way, providing a small vicinity of space per planet that you can fly around and explore. In terms of discoveries that can be made, well, it's much like on land. There is a chance to discover different things depending on what system you are in and what planet's orbit you are in, but much of the space exploration here in Starfield feels less procedural and more handcrafted, making the content that you do find feel more worthwhile. There are some highlights to the space exploration, such as communicating or docking with other ships which can provide their own stories, if not through quests but also through environmental storytelling, like docking with an abandoned rundown ship or encountering some different space pirates. There's different ships that serve as great additions as well. I docked with one ship that had people just having a party and they were like, yo, it's a celebration, come in. And then there was another ship where it just had a grandma on there and she's like, yo, come, I'll make you some food. And I was like, oh, that's wholesome. But then the feeling and tone can shift when you dock to another big freighter that can just be abandoned and vacant of people, and you just read the logs about what happened, the experiments conducted on people, how people have gone missing, and things like this, and you're like, wow, so dark. There's some really good moments here when they occur, and they do feel like finding a landmark in a Fallout or Elder Scrolls game to some extent. It just feels like, oh, there's that little thing off over there. And these types of additions, especially in the space exploration, do feel like they lean heavily into that environmental story more than the storytelling that is told through questing. And I think I do like that to some degree. However, I think where Starfield's space exploration suffers is at the core foundations of the exploration that Starfield has set, where everything feels glued together through a menu. So the way that it works is you will load into a zone, look around for any markers or anything that can just point out to you, and if you see anything, that's great. If not, there's nothing, and it feels like it's hit or miss whether or not you will make any discoveries. And I get that sense of realism that they're going for, it's intentional, but it can make the space exploration feel like you are either landing in a place with something or nothing, and there's no real reason to explore some different places. And this same thing can be applied for on land, and it feels like if there's no enemies flying around or there's nothing there besides some asteroids, it really just feels like there's a missed opportunity for something to take place. And it just feels like you're fast traveling between system to system, just hoping that something will happen sometimes. And I think that this is an aspect of the game that is underutilized and lacking, because as I mentioned earlier, with the other two core components of space exploration, the ship building, the ship resource management and gathering when you are actually fighting, I think that the space aspects of Starfield are great, and these two components are fantastic. But I think the one big thing that is pulling it down from making this aspect of the game so incredible is just the exploration, because it becomes very noticeable how segmented it is into these different hubs. And yes, I'm not trying to pull the game down. It is great when you find stuff. When the things that you do find, I do think are a ton of fun, but it is very noticeable, and it kind of feels like you remove the term exploration, because at this point I don't think that there is a heavy focus on exploration when you are in space. There is to a sense of when you dock into a different ship or something of that nature, but I think that overall going through space doesn't feel like you are really exploring. It feels like you will see something immediately and know if this place is noteworthy or if it is nothing, and then you will move on. There is nothing that is hidden, and if you would go searching you might find something, at least in my experience. Most of the time it is hit or miss with space, and to me it is kind of sad because I feel like it is underwhelming, and there is some great content in the space segments when you do dock with places, but the way that they handle traversing through space is my biggest gripe, and I feel like a bit of a mishandled opportunity. Not to mention one that I feel was a bit mismarketed, because we did know from the get-go that we wouldn't be able to land on planets, but I do think that a lot of us had an assumption that we would be able to fly around solar systems or around planets or something of that nature, and I do think that it would have been great had they had this type of functionality. And look, I'm not a game dev, I don't understand the constraints that go into making these games, and I know that it's a huge undertaking, and they have added a lot into these games. I do feel like this area, in terms of exploration, can feel a little lacking at times unless you are docking into ships or getting into dogfights. Anyway, with the negative vibes out of the way, I would like to move on to what I think Starfield nails, and one of the excellent components that I think actually makes it a fantastic game, and that is how Starfield handles handcrafted content. I think that the handcrafted content is where Starfield absolutely shines and creates many stunning stories that will stick with you after you finish the game. There is a good variety here that span and cover many different forms of sci-fi and tell many different types of stories that make up the settled systems and make it such an interesting universe. Starfield has a clever way of pointing you towards different side quests and adventures and this handcrafted content through things that are called activities. Activities can shape and take form by overhearing NPCs NPCs talk, or even people just mentioning stuff to you. This aspect of Starfield's exploration is handled tactfully. It doesn't feel like you have an exclamation mark over someone's head that points you to that place that says, "Come to me, I'm an important person," but it also puts emphasis on talking to anyone, any character really. I ran into a news station, I talked to a character and they just gave me a quest. There was nothing to insinuate that they would have a quest, but here we are. Listening to those random NPCs, going to talk to people, it makes interacting with the world feel more valuable. It feels like a quest, a story, or anything can be hidden behind any person. Starfield does also introduce the Minutemen settlement quests from Fallout 4 in the form of these things called missions. However, missions do feel like they are a good little detour that can point you towards different planets, systems, and make you just spread your wings and fly to different places. A lot of the tasks are fairly mundane. You can have people that you can carry from one planet to another, you can drop off some cargo, or just explore a planet or take out mercenaries. There's a ton of different quests here, and they are little simple things that can just add to the time and give you some free credits and XP. They are definitely a good way of leveling up early on in the game, if you're just looking for mindless things and just wanting to explore. These also do feed in well with the procedural aspects of exploration too, so keep that in mind. But the exploration is the biggest mixed bag of the overall experience here in Starfield, and I do feel like how much you're willing to accept the fragmented traversal between place to place is the more you'll be able to enjoy most of this intriguing universe and the content that it does provide. As I mentioned at the start, I've invested 100 hours into this game, and I still have a laundry list of these side quests and handcrafted content that I need to complete, and these are just based on the quests that I have found. There is so much game here, there's so much to just discover. Fully assessing this game is a hard thing to do, and I'm just going off the quantity of content that I have experienced. Overall, it is just an amazing experience when you do get these handcrafted stories and make these new discoveries. And I think that the sum of Starfield's exploration, it does have pitfalls, it does have weak aspects that can hinder the experience, and I do think if you go in wanting a particular sort of experience that Starfield isn't offering, you will easily bounce off it. But I think at its core, Starfield is a great Bethesda game, and when it leans into those aspects of being that type of game, it is an exceptional one, and it has an overwhelming amount of fun content to do. But at the same time, I do think that Starfield has provided and built a sandbox for the longevity that this game is trying to go for. So I think that the procedurally generated content, the outposts, the things of this nature are all a part of a longer plan that they have in store for Starfield, which we'll get into shortly. But the long and short of what I'm getting at here with exploration is you may find fun, and there is a lot of love and care that's been put into many aspects of this game, but some will land better than others, and some aspects of exploration can bring on some fatigue quicker than others. The handcrafted aspect of this game is an overall stellar aspect that I think any fan of a Bethesda game would love, and I think that you should stick with or at least try to experience before putting the game down. Overall, the exploration in Starfield will be the most divisive component of what people's overall enjoyment will be. There is so much here to explore and discover in terms of its size and scope, with procedurally generated worlds that will create dynamic environments, pulling influences from things like Daggerfall that, you can enjoy and there is fun to be had, but may not be for everyone, to the handcrafted content that pulls from modern BGS games that are like Oblivion and onwards that many long-term fans would be enjoying. It'll ultimately come down to how you, the player, choose to embrace and engage with many of these different systems, how you'll feel resilient to the fast travel, how much you enjoy the questing, are you into the resource gathering, the base building. There is many different aspects here that will factor into how you enjoy and engage with many of the different aspects of Bethesda's open world here in Starfield, because you may like the procedural content if you like the mining and outposts, you may like the stories more if you're into the quest-driven RPG elements. It really does come down to you and what type of person you are when playing these games, and that's why I think Starfield does offer a lot of different components to exploration, different forms and methods that feed into all of its different systems, but it may be something you bounce off if it's not for you. And whilst I loved many of the different aspects of Starfield's exploration, I do think overall I still was able to love and click with the game, but that doesn't mean that you will. So keep all these things that I've mentioned in mind, and that's why I've been critical, because this isn't a game for everyone, and I do think that exploration is the biggest divisive component when assessing Starfield. Starfield is a game that will carry a legacy. but not a legacy in a traditional sense when we generally use that phrase. I think it won't be a game that's known for how it's an industry-defining RPG or a story that moved us and made us weep. It's more a game that'll be remembered for its sheer scope and size and the design philosophy behind that and intentionality behind those designs. And I think that the reason for this design and approach to this sheer scope of 1,000 planets is because of one simple word: longevity. You see, Bethesda have a problem here that they needed to address. If you look at their track record, with each of their prior games, the development time has been getting longer and longer to create new games, which is fine, but here's a question that they need to pose. How do we keep our games relevant, alive, and ever growing in between these releases? And sure, there's a few DLCs that are coming along the way, but Bethesda has this very unique thing that makes their games remain relevant, and that is their modding community. It is my belief that Starfield has become the perfect landing ground and jumping pad for many future mods and stories to take place here, and that Bethesda is wanting to hone in on their Creation Club tools and, more importantly, modders. Bethesda has such a well-renowned modding community that make so many stories within the worlds they've created. I mean, I look at things like Fallout London or Skyblivion, and there is so many different stories here that can take place. And I think that if you look at the sheer size and scope of Starfield, it makes a lot of sense why they've gone for this. There are so many different planets that can host so many different stories for these modders to take advantage of. There is so much here, and with what can be 15 years worth of time between games, I think that lays host to so many potential stories that can be told that'll make Starfield's world feel less and less desolate with each year it grows. There's two ways to look at this. There's the cynical way where you can feel like this is Bethesda letting modders finish their game, but I also think that they've provided so much game here with over hundreds of hours of content, but they've also left room for people to add their own stories and given them their own free reins with the settled systems, being able to flesh out and tell new stories. I think that this is a win-win if it was to work in a certain way. It gives certain community modders more experience and exposure, and they could even be broadcasted through Bethesda's Creation Club for this new DLC story, and then it works for the player because they have new things to do in Starfield, new expansions to play that keep that game ever growing and alive. And I think that this, in short, is the legacy that I feel Starfield will end up leaving on the gaming industry. It'll be a single player game that is continually growing and evolving, but not in a way like a live service, but more a pseudo DLC sort of format that is community backed and installable like mods, but are DLC. Things that can be added to the game and are approved by Bethesda that can add and improve the story for the game and add new stories and just change the game in different ways. I think that this is a way that allows new talent to be recognized, whilst Bethesda are also working on their new games and expansions that are official for Starfield. I think that this is an idea that can work in many different ways, and I think in many ways Starfield is a testing ground and an experiment to see how this plays out before Bethesda implements it into their more broader and bigger IPs such as Elder Scrolls and Fallout. It is an interesting idea and concept to kind of wrestle with, and whilst it is a prediction on my part and none of this is officially been confirmed or announced, I do think that this is the sign of the times and a direction that I feel Bethesda may be heading in. And you guys can let me know whether you think I'm right or wrong in the comments. I'm happy to, have a discussion and see what your thoughts are for the future of this game and what they're going for. But yeah, my cards are on the table, and that's what I feel is the future for Starfield and the long-term plan, and some of the design that has been taken with this game reflects that. But anyway, let me know what you think, and that's the legacy that I feel Starfield's going to end up leaving on the gaming industry. So, in summary, bringing this whole review together, yes, I really did enjoy Starfield. There is a lot there to love, and after my 100 hours of playing this game, I do feel like there was a lot of memorable moments, particularly just the faction quests and the side quests that this game has, getting lost in some of the different worlds, especially early on, and just making those initial discoveries. However, I do think that Starfield is a divisive game and far from a perfect one. Starfield has many issues, particularly pertaining to its exploration. The crux of this review was discussing that. It is a mixed bag, where some different modes of exploration do fare better than others, but the core method and bones that Starfield's exploration is built upon is its biggest weakness. Starfield is a game that feels very ambitious with all the different things that it is trying to tackle, but simultaneously manages to feel outdated in its execution of these many systems. Had Starfield gone for maybe 100 planets, but had you be able to seamlessly fly around those solar systems, would we be telling a different story? But I think that overall, Starfield's exploration and its sense of discovery can be overlooked, and you can still find much enjoyment here if you are willing to look past those glaring flaws. If you're not though, Starfield is a game that sadly will not be able to click with you. I feel like this is one of the biggest aspects of that game that will either make or break your experience. Even me, someone who loves Starfield, will admit to you that the exploration, the fragmentation of it really does suck. And I wish that there was a bit more of a seamless experience here, because when you look at other Bethesda games, particularly Skyrim or Fallout, you will see that you can go from anywhere on those worlds from A to B and you can travel. You can still fast travel, and you probably will, but the fact that you can openly explore is something that separates this from Starfield. Starfield feels very limited, but once you are able to get past this barrier, this strong major hurdle, you are able to see what is underneath and what a great game Starfield truly is. It is just sad that the exploration, whether it be the procedural side or the fast travel, really does feel like it can either make or break this experience for you. There are two big things that make a Bethesda game, and they're two big aspects that I feel like are either hit or miss depending on what type of person you are and what type of games you enjoy playing. But like I said, buried underneath is a great game, and with that, Starfield is a great experience once you are able to accept its exploration for what it is. More importantly, if you can accept its exploration for what it is. There's a lot of cynicism around the shortcomings of Starfield, and yes, Starfield is far from a perfect game, but it is still a game worthy of love, and there is a lot here that I do think makes this game great. But yeah, ultimately, I think Starfield is a great game, and I think it is a game that is worthy of love, and I think that whilst it is not a perfect game, it is definitely a divisive one, but one that you should at least give a try. Just because an influencer or a friend says they didn't enjoy it doesn't mean you might not. You should at least give it a try, see for yourself if you do like it. And the good thing about Starfield is that it's on Game Pass, so if you are a Xbox Game Pass member, it's pretty cheap to play in comparison to the asking price on Steam, which is the best way I would advise you to check out Starfield if you are on the fence, because as I've reiterated in this review, it is a divisive game that may not be for you, but if it is, you will love it. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did really like the video, consider giving a thumbs up, as that does really help this channel out. If you disliked it, hit the thumbs down and leave a comment as to why, because feedback always helps and it'll let me know how to do better for next time. If you really liked the video, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, as that is a good way to be notified of what's happening on the channel, and trust me, I've got a lot of videos on the way. Thanks for watching, and I really do appreciate all the support and you guys watching my videos. Take care and see you in the next video. Peace.